Hey everybody, DreamRoom64 here, and today's video is about how I have wired up 19 different game consoles to 3 different TVs plus a recording device. Ultimately, they all go through a single HDMI cable, but the setup is actually much more complicated than that. They go to analog video outputs, so I can play them on CRT. There's just a whole lot going on. So I'm going to explain the whole process that I followed to figure this out, all the choices I made. I've first mapped it all out on paper, and later on in the video, instead of looking at that paper, which is just a rough draft, I have put the whole setup into sort of a schematic, a flowchart on the computer. So later on, we will go through this, and it's very complicated. So I'm excited to finally share this information. I've been working on it for the past couple months, making a lot of changes on the HDMI side of things. That's going to be a big focus of this. So I do need to say that this is how I've built my setup. This doesn't mean this is a perfect setup, it's optimal for everybody, but I want to explain my rationale behind everything and the thought process that really went into this. Okay, so let's start off working our way top down with the consoles over here. But before doing that, let me just explain exactly what's going on down here. So this is where everything comes together. Basically, I have all the consoles outputting one of 3 types of video signals. I have RGB SCART, YPbPr component video, or HDMI. So each of these switches has 8 inputs. These two here this has 2 outputs, this has 2 outputs, this has 1 output. Now I wanted to do a lot of advanced things with HDMI. I wanted my setup to be very dynamic and be able to change things and test different screens out. So I've taken the HDMI output of this 8-in, 1-out switch, and I have split it. And then I split it again, and then I split it again. So I'll explain all that once we get to the flow chart of this, but it is complicated. It took me the past couple months to actually figure out a combination of devices that would work. Another big part of the setup is the power management. So you've seen this in my other videos before if you've watched the channel, but I use a series of these 10 outlet switches. Now, some people have asked, how do you plug in something with like a bulky power supply to these? So I can't technically recommend you do this, but I will share my secret here, because technically you're not supposed to plug something like this into a relocatable power tap, but these are way more sufficient than the power that I'm putting onto them. You know, I'm plugging like a little 3DS charger in here, or a USB adapter or something light duty. I'm not overloading these. So again, technically you're not supposed to take this and then plug it into the back of this. But the way I've done it, I think, is safe in my non-professional opinion. I will oftentimes secure a power brick to this so that it can't even become unplugged. It's very snugly attached to this. And I'm not plugging like 3 hair dryers and a plasma TV in here. I think I'm being pretty safe. So that's the secret here. I use the power strips with the individual switches. It is a manual process to flip them on, but you know, it's really not inconvenient to do it this way. So as you see, the NES is on, the NES is off. So that's how it works. Let's work our way, like I said, top to bottom up here, and I'll explain the rationale behind the different cable choices and all that, because it is important to understand that I have opted to not HDMI mod any of the consoles. So all the consoles that you see in here are still using analog video output. And that's again because I like the option of being able to use legacy displays. Like this plasma TV here actually doesn't, or monitor, doesn't actually have any digital inputs. Or usually I'll have my CRT there. I've made this setup so that I can pick the CRT up, plop the plasma down of choice, anything 37 to 42 inches, or swap in a different CRT, like a 27-inch CRT between these shielded speakers. And I can use this as a spot to basically just try out different ideas, test different screens. It's kind of a fun little idea I had, and so far it's working. So I don't have it perfectly cable managed here, but it's pretty clean. You can see I have 2 different HDMI cables coming here. I'll explain why there's 2. I've got the RGB SCART with the sync there, and I have the component right now going into this old plasma monitor. All right, well, let's work our way top to bottom here, as I keep saying I'm trying to do. Okay, so right here, Wii U, it's basically a no-brainer. You want to hook your Wii U up over HDMI, and it's the only way to get surround sound out of the Wii U. Now, as for the switch, your only choice is HDMI, but something important to understand is that I like to process the video of my HDMI sources I don't like to just send them generally straight to the TV. So the Switch and all the other HDMI consoles are going into the RetroTink 4K, and I can apply any kind of processing I want to them. Like, let's say I'm playing a pixel art retro style game on the Switch, and it just doesn't look that good by default, in my opinion. There's no filters in the game that you can control to make it look like a CRT. But with the RetroTink 4K, I can do magical things and make it look like an LCD screen, or make it look like kind of a CRT with scan lines. It's pretty neat. So that's something I enjoy playing around with and having the power to do. And that is something I will focus on more in the future on the channel, trying to figure out what are great ways to play these games and make them look optimal. All right, now here's the Analogue Pocket. So Analogue Pocket on the dock is a really great way to play Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy games on a modern display. And it doesn't actually, despite the Analogue name, doesn't currently support any way to get analog video out of it. I'm fine with just using HDMI. If I were to want to play a Game Boy game or a Game Boy Advance game on my CRT, for example, I would just use the Game Boy player plus homebrew software called the Game Boy Interface. It's the best software you can use to play those games on a Game Boy player. And over here, I could, if I wanted to, use the Super Game Boy 2, for example, to play them on a CRT. So not too worried about not having an official way to get analog video out of the Analogue Pocket. And then over here is kind of a work in progress. I have some handhelds there. Still working on labeling a couple things. I like these old-fashioned label makers, but mine is starting to fail and not work that great. It's getting kind of goofy, but there's a little bit more work to do here, but I figured I was ready to make the video at this point. All right, now let's talk about these consoles here in the middle two rows. Now these are all consoles that I would generally use wired controllers for. So that's why I have them a little bit lower than the consoles up top, which are HDMI consoles, modern consoles that use wireless controllers. It just makes a little more sense to not have the controller cord dangling down further. Now, one exception though is that I do really like a wireless controller, aftermarket wireless controller for the Dreamcast, as well as the Nintendo 64. I have one of them right here. It's a Retro Fighters, and some other products are kind of hit or miss, but I do really like this one. And what I don't like about them though is that they have bulky dongles. So let me just show you this. I have here the dongle for the Retro Fighters controller with the VMU plugged in, and then right here I have the dongle for the Retro Fighters N64 controller with an aftermarket modern Forever Pack 64. So it's just basically a memory card that doesn't use a battery like the original Nintendo branded one. And I don't have to worry about save file corruption or loss from a battery. But yeah, I don't like these bulky dongles. They look kind of terrible when they're plugged into the console sitting on the shelf. But this solution I found, just run a single extension cord down to the ground from each console. I've had luck using this, no problems with save files, no problems with connection from the wireless controllers, and it lets me get those out of the way. So unfortunately, I don't get to see the VMU any longer, but I can live without seeing it. It's not essential for most games. All right, let's go back up here and let's talk about the consoles and some of the choices that went into them. All right, so I have what's here is the very first model Genesis. There's multiple revisions of the first model Genesis. I have what is, as far as I know, the earliest one. It's a non-TMSS Genesis. If you search that, you can get a little bit more information about it. But I like this one because without a mod, I get beautiful RGB video output and stunning stereo sound. Now it is showing its age. I do need to probably replace the power supply, and I also probably need to recap the console. I get buzzing sometimes, but when it was new, this console had, from the factory, a beautiful stereo and RGB output. Now I've chosen to use RGB SCART as my connector of choice for the Genesis. So it goes down to the RGB SCART switch. Composite out of this one is very poor, and some people actually say, you know, they want to play their Genesis on composite, from composite video, because they like the way the pixels blend together for the pixel art. And it's a good argument, but I personally prefer an overall sharp image with vibrant, like, great color. So I prefer RGB for the Genesis. Now moving over here is Saturn. As far as I know, there actually isn't any official there's no official, but there is no HDMI mod for the Saturn. Nobody's ever done it yet for original Saturn hardware. So RGB SCART is really as good as it's going to get, and it comes, you don't have to do a mod or anything, it just comes straight out of the console. I run that guy down to the SCART switch. Now the Dreamcast does have a couple HDMI mods out there. It's a pretty difficult mod to install from what I've seen, and that goes for pretty much all the HDMI mods. They're difficult to install and pretty expensive to buy the kits. The Dreamcast outputs a beautiful VGA signal, but here's the problem, is that VGA is kind of inconvenient to plug into most things. So what I've done is recently I bought the retro, I think it's called retro gaming cables, powered by RetroTink component video cable. So it's a YPbPr component video cable, which means it can plug into a consumer CRT TV very easily, or very importantly for me, I can plug it into a 480p plasma monitor very conveniently. The plasma monitor does have a VGA input, but it's kind of inconvenient to run a VGA cable just for that one console, figure out what to do with the audio from the Dreamcast. And you know, I have the whole setup set to switch one of those 3 output types I talked about earlier, RGB SCART component or HDMI. I wanted the Dreamcast to have some level of convenience, so that's why I went with that cable, although it was expensive. All right, so the PlayStation 1 here, the PS1, let me just mention 2 quick mods that are going on here. So I have the XStation ODE in there. I installed that myself. It's a little tricky to solder in, but not terribly difficult. And then I have a MemCard Pro 2 from 8-Bit Mods. And this pairing of the MemCard Pro plus the XStation is wonderful. I no longer have to worry about which memory card has my save file on it, because PlayStation 1 memory cards only have 15 blocks. This just gets the job done perfectly between the two. Everything is seamless. Now, in terms of video output, I'm using RGB SCART. The PS1 outputs a nice clean RGB signal, no mod needed. One other consideration though is I think you might have to research the type of sync you want to get for the cable. I don't know much about sync and all that, so I'm not really the guy to ask, but one thing I can recommend is if you might want to get a cable like this that has a composite jack on there. Because let's say you want to play your PS1 on a CRT and you want to play Point Blank or you want to play Time Crisis, you're going to want a place to plug the Joy-Con or the Gun-Con composite into. And this model here, the earliest PS1, it does have the jack, so I actually don't need this version of the cable, but it is something to keep in mind if you are going to go the kind of the route I went. All right, now PS2. So PS2, I got the same thing going on here. I have a MemCard Pro, but or it's the MemCard Pro 2 specifically. The PS2, I don't even have any mods going on with it because there is no ODE available for it currently. And the HDMI mods, to me, don't really seem like they'll add anything because I can get a nice clean component or RGB signal out of the PS2. And either way, I want to use something like the RetroTink 4K Pro to handle deinterlacing of the PS2. I don't want to use some internal mod. I think from what I've seen, you generally are going to get better quality going the route that I've went here. Although you could do an HDMI mod and maybe try to get the raw digital signal out of the PS2 into an advanced scaler. I don't know. I'm happy, let's just say, I'm happy with component video output. Now I've also tried SCART out, RGB SCART out of the PS2. The only challenge then is that I have to route the cable about a foot longer than what the PS1 is routing its cable. You can see the distance between these two. And being that the furthest corner of the setup here for consoles that output analog signals, it's a long path to doing right angles to keep clean cable management. That's a lot of work and unfortunately a long cable. And you don't want analog video cables to be long. You want them to be short. I happen to have a component video cable that was the right length and very good quality, an old Rocketfish branded one. It goes down there, it's reasonably well hidden, and it goes down into the component switch. Now, furthermore, I like having the PlayStation 2 set up over component because I really enjoy the PlayStation 2 on my 480p plasma monitor. It looks really good, and it just makes it a little bit more convenient to get it playing on there with the component. Okay, let's move on down to the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, the Nintendo Entertainment System, unfortunately, from the factory, it's only going to output RF or composite. Composite being your better choice. And the composite video looks very good on, say, like a 13-inch consumer Trinitron. I really like the look in that circumstance, but I don't like the composite video on a PVM, or I don't like it on even larger CRT than like 20 inches or so. So for me, I went the route of Tim Worthington's RGB mod. It's unfortunately expensive, it's a little tricky to install, but it's well worth it for me. I am sacrificing the original color palette, and I am sacrificing the ability to have dithering in the pixel art. But that overall crisp, sharp image out of the Nintendo Entertainment System is worth it for me. All right, now right here is the Super Nintendo Junior. And the Super Nintendo Junior is generally regarded as the best video quality Super Nintendo model. As far as I know, there is no HDMI mod for a Super Nintendo console, and you can get good video quality now out of the other models, as far as I understand. But I like the styling of this one. I like the size and shape, and the RGB, you do have to mod it to get RGB output capability, but it's a very easy, inexpensive mod. I did it myself, no problem at all. Great quality image out of this guy. Now right here, the Nintendo 64, the best you can get out of the factory, out of the Nintendo 64, is S-Video. Now, by doing an RGB mod, you're not gaining great extra sharpness or anything, unless you do the de-blur mod. You're basically just getting the convenience of not having a straggler in your setup that uses S-Video still. So I did the RGB mod to it mainly so that I could plug it into my RGB switch down here. And now I don't have a composite video straggler. I don't have an S-Video straggler. I don't have a VGA straggler. Everything is going the way I want. Now, one more thing I should mention on the Nintendo 64 is if you do want to RGB mod it, you have to keep in mind there's different model revisions out there of the motherboard. So the older ones, it's a very easy mod. The later version motherboards, it's tougher. And all the Fantastic consoles, from what I understand, have that later motherboard. I really like the Fantastic shells, and I already had an older Nintendo 64 in my house. So what I did was I took the shell of the Fantastic and put the board of an older model inside of it and did the mod to that board. Now, it was a completely non-destructive mod. You can't even tell. The screws from this case and the other board all aligned perfectly, and it was just a seamless operation. Then I'm left with a very easily modded, RGB modded Nintendo 64. Everything went smoothly there. Now, as far as the GameCube, you want to get a GameCube with the digital video output port on the back. Most of them have that port, but not all of them, of course. On the later models, they took that off as a cost-cutting measure. But what I'm using is the Eon GC HD Mark II. And you can see there's an HDMI port on there, which I'm not using. I'm actually just using the component video output capability of the Eon GC HD Mark II. What I just said, the Eon GC HD Mark II, it's more expensive than some of the other options out there by like quite a bit, but I like it. I like having the option of HDMI or a clean analog output, which uses Wii component cable. So that's actually what's plugged in there. It's a high quality Wii component cable, which then goes down to the component switch. So I like using component output on the GameCube because, well, I can play it on my 480p plasma, I can play it on a consumer CRT easily, or I can run it into the RetroTink 4K still and get a great clean output that looks honestly indistinguishable from an HDMI upscale. So I'm very happy with this configuration that I have going on there. I should mention I have the GC, what do you call this thing? I have the GC loader. So the GC loader, it costs more than other options to play games off an SD card on your GameCube, but this one just works so well. And it lets you, with Swiss, you can then force any game to be 480p, even if it didn't support 480p originally. Basically, it works so well, and I've had problems with the SD2 SP2. So it was a good choice to make that switch to the GC loader for me, even though, yeah, again, there's cheaper options out there. It's a long-term thing for me. I'm never getting rid of my GameCube. I wanted to get what I would consider the definitive ODE. All right, right here is a Wii. Now, to get the best video quality out of the Wii, you do need to do an HDMI mod. You'd also want to use homebrew software to change some kind of a flicker filter that I understand is applied to the output. I haven't done either of those things, but I'm just using component video, 480p setting in the Wii, and it's decent enough. I'm not a huge player of the Wii games these days, so it's not a priority to do an HDMI mod on that, and it does look like a tricky HDMI mod. Okay, coming down to the original Xbox, this is a console a lot of people will say, it is worthwhile to do an HDMI mod for it, and I can definitely see the value in that, because one of the things about the Xbox is that it has Dolby Digital audio output, and to get that output, you can't just plug a cable directly into the back of the Xbox. You need a high quality component cable like the one I'm using here. I'm using the original Microsoft OEM component cable, which adds an optical jack to the top of the console, to the top of the port right there. So HDMI mod I think would make sense for most people, though it is a complicated mod. You also want to do a soft mod on your Xbox, and you want to get the clock capacitor out of there so that it doesn't destroy the board. Make sure you do some research on the clock capacitor if you've never heard of that. But I'm really happy with just the component video output of the Xbox going into the component video switch, and then I can, again, play it on the 480p plasma if I feel like it, or play it through the RetroTink 4K upscaled to 4K on my 4K TV, or upscaled to 1080p for my 1080p plasma, which is in the setup. So as far as audio, as you saw back there, I have that Toslink cable in there, and then I route that over into this Toslink switch, which has 3 inputs on the back and 1 output on the front. And this switch, I'm using also one more of its inputs from the DVD player right there, the DVD combo player. And then the output of this goes into the RetroTink 4K. And that's an automatic Toslink switch. It's on the market right now, it's cheap, and it just seems to just work. I'm really happy with that. As I said, I did do a soft model on the Xbox. I think I disabled some kind of a blur flicker filter that's on by default. It makes the output look a lot cleaner, and I'm happy with that. And let's move over here. I got a couple more things to mention. Let's look at down here. I got something hidden. Got the PSP 3000. So this, I don't have this fully figured out yet, but I do have the PSP official original OEM component cable right here. And that's plugged in right here, or actually back further. And then I have the PSP power supply there. So if I want to charge the PSP, I can just flip the PSP switch here and then start charging it. I also have the 3DS XL and my DSi XL. So then check this out. If I flip the switch for 3DS, well, it's already fully charged, but there we go. And I'll flip the switch off. So I can charge these up pretty conveniently down here and pick them up. This is an idea I had to do. And I think we already talked about the dongles over here. Let me just show you this. This is my Atomos Ninja 5 HDMI recorder. So you can see here, it's got a solid state drive on the back, and it has a battery, and it also has HDMI input. And this is a product mainly marketed to use as a monitor with video cameras. And I'm using it though currently as a HDMI video recorder. So I can record gameplay footage from this setup. So I'll get into it in a little bit if we go to that schematic flowchart. But ultimately, I have one of the outputs of the 4K or RetroTink 4K and the HDMI before the RetroTink 4K does any processing going into this guy. So I have, this is old monoprice manual HDMI switch. Check this out. It's a manual HDMI switch. I believe it can work in either direction. Right now I'm using it for 2 inputs, 1 output. Choose between those 2 inputs to go to the output. And like I said, I have the RetroTink 4K running in here, and then I have the unprocessed HDMI signal, and I can choose to record whichever I want. Do I want to just record the bare output of the console, or do I want to record the output of the console with all kinds of processing from the RetroTink 4K applied? And I can then maybe demonstrate on the channel to some extent, for keeping YouTube compression in mind, what kind of quality I can get out of the RetroTink 4K in my setup. That's still something I'm exploring. I'm still doing a lot of work to figure out exactly how to get the most out of this thing. I need to read the manual. I've read part of the manual. I need to finish it. And then one more console. Let's just talk about consoles again. I got the Xbox 360 here. This is just sitting there for display. I just think it looks cool. Okay, I needed to fill that space with something. I have a different Xbox 360, which is actually hooked up, and let's go take a look at that. So the Xbox 360 that's actually hooked up is right here. So this one, I set the video output to 720p. I run a long HDMI cable from here over to the RetroTink 4K, or over to the switcher. All these consoles here go into that 8-input HDMI switch. Let's take a look here at the PS3. Again, long HDMI cable. I'm actually using an optical HDMI cable. The PS3, you have to keep in mind, has HDCP encrypted video output. I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the flowchart, but I had to find a solution to work around that. I set the video output to 720p and 1080p. Both of those boxes are checked. And I also have it enabled for 3D play. I can play the PS3 through the old Denon receiver down there, which is then plugged into the Panasonic TV, 1080p plasma, the ST50. I can play PS3 games in 3D if I want. And then right here's the PS4 Pro. That has a 2 terabyte SSD in there. I actually play that primarily in 1080p. I do have the super sampling mode enabled because what I found is that the PS4 and the Xbox One X are so much nicer to play on a 1080p plasma than on an OLED. The motion clarity is just so good. The colors on that particular, those late plasma, or really any plasma, just looks so nice and pleasing, like a really natural warm glow to the light. I love it. And then right here, here's the Xbox One X with a 2 terabyte SSD installed in there. It runs so much better than when it was brand new. And again, I play it on the Plasma primarily, and I'm just skipping the Series X and the PS5. I don't even own them. I don't own a Switch 2. I'll get a Switch 2 someday, but I'm in no hurry. I got so much entertainment to keep me busy and so many projects to work on. I am absolutely not in a hurry to get it and pay, you know, $80 for games I already have on other platforms and stuff, and things I'm not even interested in. So yeah, that's kind of just a quick summary of how I feel about modern gaming. But let me show you one more thing here. See, I have the RetroTink remote sitting here. That's just kind of remind me to show you something. So right here, I have a little IR repeater. So this takes the IR signal from the RetroTink remote. If I'm sitting here on the couch and I want to dial in some settings, that thing will pick up the signal from this remote and then relay it over to here. So I can still use the RetroTink 4K very conveniently, pointing the remote forward at the other TV, even though it's situated over here in the setup. And the power for that little IR blaster comes from, let me get back here. The power comes from back here at the back of the LG OLED C1. I have it plugged into the USB port. So when the TV's powered on, that IR repeater gets power. I got the RetroTink 4K plugged in with the HDMI CEC blocker. I'll explain why I need that. I have the Yamaha audio video receiver plugged here into the eARC port. And then I have my main, more powerful gaming PC plugged into this port right here over a very long optical HDMI cable. All right, with that shown, let's jump over to the PC. And we are going to take a look at this flowchart. Okay, here we are in the flowchart, and I decided to add a few pages. So I have a page here for HDMI to break just that out. I have a page to break out just the RGB SCART switching, and a page just to break out the component video switching. So it should be a lot easier to follow with this path. And I'll have a PDF version that you can download and print, or just look on your screen if you want to follow along that way, in case this is a little bit small on whatever device you're watching this on. All right, well anyway, let's start off with the HDMI setup. I'll explain a little bit better how it's all set up, what you saw earlier in this video. So we have the 8x1 automatic HDMI switch. Now this is a bottleneck in my setup because this is an inexpensive switch that I'm using, barely costs anything, and it tops out at 4K 30. But it turns out that's actually okay because all the things that I'm using as inputs, I don't need higher than that, and the RetroTink 4K actually doesn't really accept 4K inputs anyway, so this works out fine. Now what I have that going into is an HDMI 1.4 splitter, and what's important to understand is that the PS3, which is one of the inputs, has HDCP encryption. That's incompatible with the RetroTink 4K. The RetroTink 4K is HDCP compliant. So what you'll find is that certain splitters, this is kind of a gray area, but certain splitters out there will remove that HDCP encryption, and then everything goes a little bit smoother from that point on. So I'm using a really old one that I got years ago, and it's an HDMI 1.4 splitter, passes 3D no problem, and it maxes out at 1080p. So again, that bottleneck up here, well, I just introduced another bottleneck here, and it's okay because mainly, you know, I play these things on a 1080p plasma TV, or I use the RetroTink 4K to upscale them. Now moving down the chain, since this is a splitter, it gives me two outputs from the single output of that automatic switch above. So, you know, let's just follow this path first. This goes into the RetroTink 4K Pro and then out. I feed that into an HDMI CEC-less adapter. What this is it's basically a super short, like inch-long HDMI cable, if you think of it that way, but it's missing, from what I understand, one of the pins, and that pin controls HDMI CEC. It enables HDMI CEC. And for some reason, the RetroTink 4K, even though it's not CEC capable, it interferes with my existing equipment. So if the RetroTink 4K doesn't have this little adapter on there, the volume control between my TV and receiver breaks, the playback control between my streaming box and my Blu-ray player, and everything just breaks. So I have to have this inexplicably in the chain. And I don't know why these things cost about $20, but they do. So that's in there. And now that CEC adapter, which is just in between there, and just sticking at the back of the RetroTink 4K, goes into a 1x4 splitter. So here we are with another splitter. So we had a splitter up here, and now we have a new splitter, because the idea is to take the output, that single HDMI output of the RetroTink 4K, the only kind of output it has is HDMI, and then I want to split that. Now, I did spend a little bit extra, and I got a switch that's rated as 8K 30, they say. So the reason I picked a switch that's you know, you would think, why buy a fancier switch when I have a bottleneck up here? Well, since the RetroTink 4K upscales things and can apply all kinds of things like HDR injection and deep color and all that, and high frame rates like 120 hertz signals with BFI injection, I need to use a very capable splitter, something that can handle above the HDMI 2.0 spec. So that's why I picked this guy. It was roughly $60, whereas the one over here is roughly a third of that, roughly $20. But let's stay focused over here. So this 1x4 splitter, I use all 4 of its outputs. One of its output goes into that 2x1 manual switch that I showed earlier for using my Ninja 5 recorder. So that, again, that's going to let me capture gameplay footage, and I just pick, do I want the RetroTink 4K output, or do I want the non-RetroTink 4K output, the raw, straight from the console HDMI source? Okay, moving down, we've got the 1x4 splitter also from the RetroTink 4K going into what I call the guest TV monitor. So that's where I explained I can swap any screen out that I want over in that area to try out different things and to demo different plasma TVs that I pick up, or perhaps even some LCDs if I feel like it. Really anything with an HDMI port, I can test over there. Now, another thing I've done is I've sent the video output of the RetroTink 4K down to the Denon audio video receiver. That is hooked exclusively into the 1080p plasma TV. So this lets me play any of the consoles upscaled by the RetroTink 4K, or any source like a DVD player or the VCR runs through there as well. So I can output that ultimately to the plasma TV. Now let's look at the HDMI splitter again. That has one of its outputs going directly into the LG OLED TV, so my LG OLED C1 TV. And what I have going on here is eARC. So eARC sends the audio from the TV to the receiver. The receiver here, HDMI 2.1 compliant, so it has eARC, sends the signal to the speakers over the speaker wire. And I've tested it hooking this output directly into the Yamaha, as well as I show here, directly into the TV. In either way, it seems to work, but I think it's probably, since the RetroTink 4K can output so many strange video formats that are atypical, I think it makes more sense to send it directly into the TV than risk the Yamaha failing to accept the signal, even though so far it has seemed to work. I have this TV set to PC input to make sure everything looks as good as possible. And I have run into a problem where there seems to be about, roughly by my estimation, without any good tools, 100 milliseconds of audio lag. No video lag if I were to feed it through the AVR, but yeah, audio lag. And that's really problematic for rhythm gaming. I don't currently have a solution to that other than replace the audio video receiver and hope to find one someday that doesn't have audio processing lag. I'm pretty sure there's lag there. Okay, now let's take a look back up the chain. We're going back to that original 1x2 splitter. So we're going to stop talking about the RetroTink 4K, and we're going to focus on just basically the raw output of these sources. So one of the ideas here is to not always have to use the RetroTink 4K. Sometimes I want to just play these consoles directly on my 1080p plasma. If I was playing any of these sources on the OLED TV, I'd always want to upscale them. But again, for the plasma, I sometimes just want to skip that step and basically just use pass-through straight to the consoles. The RetroTink 4K, from what I've been able to gather, can't just pass the signal through without dialing in any settings at all. It always wants to do something to the signal. All right, so we've got the pure signal here. It's capable of sending 3D down, which, by the way, I had some issues getting 3D to feed through the RetroTink 4K Pro. Could have just been my inability to figure out how to make that work, but I found it's so much easier. Let's just send the signal straight to the TV through a different chain. So yeah, I have the 1x4 with a splitter here going into this other splitter. And something I need to mention that I haven't said yet, this splitter here, this old one, I found that if I try to use a more modern splitter, things just break inexplicably. I truly can't explain it. I've also tried putting splitters at different areas of the setup. Bad things happen. This particular configuration here just happened to work. HDMI barely makes any sense. I was so happy to finally get it working. I spent so much time on this. Okay, so anyway, that HDMI output here, again, goes down to this 1x4 splitter. I'm only using 3 of the 4 outputs of this splitter here. And like I said earlier, this is a basic splitter. It's rated for 4K 60. That's about the standard that you'll find today. And you have to pay more to get an 8K 30 splitter today. So this was roughly $20 or so. So I just picked this for economical reasons. Okay, working our way down. one of those three outputs goes into that 2x1 manual switch for the Ninja 5 again. So like I've said a couple times now, I can pick, do I want to record the bare output of the console, or do I want to record the RetroTink 4K processed output? And I can compare them and possibly use that for future videos. Now, another one of the outputs goes into an HDMI audio extractor. So what this is it's a little box, you feed it an HDMI cable, and then it has either an optical audio output or a 3.5 millimeter jack that you can send stereo analog audio out of, and it seems to be pretty good quality. So the reason I have to use this is because, let's say I'm using one of those guest TVs, just a TV I'm demoing. What I've found is that if that TV or monitor doesn't have speaker outputs, like stereo output jacks, this helps me get around that limitation that many TVs or monitors have. This totally solves the problem. And this actually goes into a mixer, which we'll talk about later. But the mixer then goes into a little stereo amp that I have sitting at that area. And then one more thing, the splitter, as I've said, also goes directly into the Denon audio video receiver. So the idea there is just to directly play any of those HDMI sources on the plasma TV with no additional processing, no upscaling needed. I can just enjoy them right away without fiddling around with the RetroTink 4K. There's not a whole lot of benefit of using that to upscale 720p all the time. And 1080p, of course, doesn't need any upscaling to play on a 1080p plasma. So that's the whole HDMI setup. Let's move on over to a couple more simplified diagrams here. We've got the G-SCART switch diagram here. So this is for RGB signals over a SCART connector. And right here I've got the consoles that we already talked about that I showed earlier in the video. And these are all consoles that generally I like to play on a standard definition CRT, and most people would agree that's probably the best way to play these things. Now, since I have an older model of the G-SCART switch, the newer models have two SCART outputs. My older model has an HD15 video output. It's a VGA connector and a 3.5 millimeter analog audio output. So let's start over here, actually. So I send those two specialized outputs into the RetroTink 4K, and then the RetroTink 4K chain follows as we just saw on the other page. And as far as the second output of this thing, the G-SCART switch, I use that to a SCART to BNC/RCA breakout cable, because generally I'm playing these consoles up here on my Sony PVM, and you can't directly plug a SCART cable into a Sony PVM. You need to use a breakout cable, and I need to extract the audio out of that path. So that's exactly what a breakout cable does. I route the BNC connectors to the PVM the RGB signal in the sync, and then I route the stereo analog audio to the stereo analog amp over there, except really it goes into the mixer. We'll talk about that mixer shortly. But yeah, that's the whole RGB SCART setup. It's a lot easier to look at this way than when we were over on the the other sheet, which we'll come back here. All right, now let's talk about the YPbPr component video switch. Now this is slightly more complicated because a couple of the sources here have optical audio output to get the best signal. A DVD player or the original Xbox need that for Dolby Digital 5.1 audio. The other sources just use stereo cables, like the Wii, GameCube, and PS2. They have surround sound, but it's Dolby Pro Logic 2, and that is just sent over standard analog stereo cables. So there's no need for optical for those consoles to get surround sound. Now, what I do here is I send the output of those with audio and video, the video side over to generally a plasma monitor. As you saw, I temporarily had set up in my configuration, or it could be a CRT. And then I send the audio again into that topping MX3, which right before here, if this weren't the simplified diagram, you'd see the mixer, so that I don't have to change inputs on this guy. Okay, now over here on the RetroTink 4K side of things, since any setup where I'm using the RetroTink 4K, like my ST50 1080p Panasonic Plasma or my LG OLED C1 4K TV, I have a 5.1 surround sound setup. I want to get that 5.1 audio routed through the RetroTink 4K so I can enjoy it on those two setups. So what I do here is the Xboxes goes into that Toslink switch we talked about earlier. The optical output of the DVD player goes also into one of the inputs. I have one open input on here remaining, and then the output of that 3x1 switch goes directly into the RetroTink 4K's optical audio input. And just the video actually both the audio and the video, go here, because I need to cover the audio of these consoles that have analog outputs as well. And then once again, just follow the RetroTink 4K path on one of the other sheets to understand where this goes. Now with all that said, let's go back to the main sheet here, and we'll finally take a look at this, but we don't have to go through the whole thing. You'd really want to do that on your own if you're really curious about this. We're just going to talk about the start items here, because those are the things that may need additional explanation. All right, so right here I have the gaming PC that I'm still working on setting up. That'll be a future video topic once I figure that out more. I want to install Bazzite Linux on there and make it like a true lounge chair gaming PC setup. It should be a lot of fun, but there's going to be a lot of troubleshooting and work that's probably going to go into that, and I'll get to it eventually. And I had to use this thing called an EDID manager, a hardware solution, temporarily in the mix. I should be able to find a software solution to override the EDID, the EDID, as some people say. That's just temporary. All right, now coming down here, this is an important discussion. I'm using the G-SCART switch and the G-Comp switch, and they're pretty old. I've had my G-SCART switch for about 9 years at this point. And nowadays there's a new thing on the market called the scalable video switch. Now it's in pre-order status. It's always probably going to be sold out basically. But if I were building this whole setup from scratch, that's what I'd go with. But today, since I already have the setup built and it's working so well for me, I wouldn't do that. I did a cost analysis where I compared how much does my setup currently cost in terms of the G-Comp switch, G-SCART switch, and the optical audio switch. I looked at that, and then I looked at what does the scalable video switch cost if built to the same, to my current needs. And it would be slightly cheaper actually to build the scalable video switch. But if I built the scalable video switch to have that additional capacity, the unused 2 inputs on the G-SCART switch and the unused 1 input on the G-Comp switch and that 1 unused input on the Toslink switch, it would actually cost more. So really, at the end of this, the scalable video switch or the G switches, they're both expensive. Again, I would go for the scalable video switch because it has a lot of conveniences like automatic profile selection on the RetroTink 4K and all kinds of future expansion capabilities that you don't really get with the G-Comp and the G-SCART switch. But furthermore, you also need to consider which one might work better in terms of wiring for your setup. Because right now, if you look at my setup, the G-Comp and the G-SCART switch perfectly slot into the shelf I have. They are perfectly wired in. Everything's just working great. That's why I'm not upgrading. The price is so similar. And one more thing I should add is that if you look up the G-Comp and the G-SCART switch on eBay, there aren't really bargains on these things. When they get listed, they sell for a lot of money. They hold their value. So no matter what you pick, I think you're in good shape. Although you're spending a lot of money, you're buying a long-term solution that you can enjoy, hopefully, almost forever. All right, let's go on to the next start item here. We have the stereo passive RCA mixer. So what this thing is it's a little unpowered passive mixer. You plug 4 different inputs into it, up to 4, and then you pass 1 output out to an amplifier, and it lets you take those 4 inputs and mix the audio all together and just have a single output. You never have to switch anything. It doesn't use any power. It is fairly expensive for what it is, but it works great. The only con to using it is that it does cut down on the volume. So I have to turn the amp up louder than if I weren't using it. But this is a safe solution to getting all of my sources into the single stereo input on that little amplifier without having to add an extra switcher and deal with that. It's a much safer option than using something like stereo Y splitter cables. You're not really supposed to use those to split an input. They're generally, from what I understand, okay to split an output, but they're not safe to use to split an input. At least that's my understanding. Okay, another thing I want to talk about here is this stereo amp selector switch, and that's a homemade switch. It's not actually perfectly optimal, the kind of switch I used. It could be dangerous to use it if I were to flip the speaker selection while both amps are on. I explain a little bit more about that in my wacky setup video. So if you're curious about that, I'd check that video out. All right, right here, the Ultra HD Blu-ray player, I want to point out that that's wired into the audio video receiver, and then the video signal is output into the OLED TV. So instead of routing this into the OLED TV directly, the reason I didn't do that is because the C1 doesn't accept DTS audio encodes. This going directly into the audio video receiver gets around that issue. That's why I chose to do that. Here's one more thing. I actually have a second one of these HDMI CEC adapters, that thing that blocks the CEC pin. I can't explain why I needed it here because I have one right above here, but it seemed like I was having eARC issues if I didn't have this plugged in at the back of my C1. And ever since I plugged it in, I've no longer had issues. Now let's go down to the last one, or second to last one here. Audio lag. As I said, I think there's some audio lag here, roughly 100 milliseconds if my manual test using the Guitar Hero controller is accurate. There's a problem there. I don't currently have a great solution to it. I did test different things to try to get around it, and I couldn't find a solution. Now, this just gets a little odd here. I'm running the RCA pre-outs of the Yamaha into this old classic 1974 Kenwood stereo amplifier. And I do that to power my front speakers with this guy here. And I really like the warm sound that I get out of this. So that's why I have my turntable and my CD player plugged in there. I could plug these into the Yamaha AVR. This has a phono preamp in it. And of course it has analog or optical inputs that I could run the CD player into, which I'm actually using a DVD player right now. But I just like listening to music through this thing, either with headphones or with the large Martin Logan front speakers I have. It has tone controls, and it's just a nice amplifier. All right, so that's the whole setup. Let me know what you guys think. There's a whole lot going on here. I recommend downloading the PDF, which I'll share a link to that in the description. Also in the description, I'll put links to some of the HDMI devices if I can find them on Amazon for you. Some of the stuff's older, some of it, you know, I can't link to everything. It's not all available. But yeah, I'll put links to that stuff. And if you want to try to build a setup like this, keep in mind it's obviously very expensive. It's very inconvenient, but it's very rewarding in the end. And a lot of the things that you've seen here, they're very specialty products. They're not always stocked. You have to be patient when you order a lot of these things. And a lot of them, unfortunately, are sold not in your own country, and you might be subject to duties if you buy them, which is increasingly an issue. But with all that said, let me know what you think about this. Hopefully I gave you guys all some ideas. I hope to catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.